Welcome back to Advertising is Dead. Hey Akshay, it's good to have you on the show.
Thanks a lot, Varun. Great to be here.
When you and I spoke during our pre-chat, one of the things that stood out for me is just like how the thought of your company's been built and on the product and everything else. And it's a big good place to start to kind of run through how it all came about and how did your journey to building out what you're building happen?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it goes back a while. I've always been interested in this whole area of biotech, biochemistry, and that kind of stuff. And I spent some time working in the pharma industry. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to work with different areas within this organization, where it was pharma on one side, but then there was a lot of diagnostics as well. And through that process, it became pretty clear that you have pharmaceuticals that can help address disease states, and then you have diagnostics that can take it as catch things a little earlier and possibly help you improve outcomes, improve prognosis, and even prevent certain things from escalating. And then just zooming out and taking that a step further back, most of the diseases that people today face are lifestyle related. I mean, infectious diseases are, I mean, with the exception of the last 12 months, obviously, uh,
Mhm.
infectious diseases are on the downward spiral. And there is this massive increase in the number of lifestyle diseases, whether it's, related to your blood sugar, heart disease, increases in certain number of cancers, and all that sort of a thing just made it clear that there's a lot that we can be doing proactively on a personal level before we let things escalate. And digging into that, it became really clear that of all the things that are in our control, nutrition is hands down the most influential on any aspect of our health.
Mhm.
And yeah, with that general thought process, and all through this while studying stuff and working in this industry, it sort of also coincided with an interest in fitness. And what was pretty cool back in college was, you're reading about what protein does to your body, and then you're actually trying it out on yourself with a
Yeah.
fairly, low risk, high reward kind of scenario. And just seeing those sort of things firsthand, it just gives you confidence in the space, and confidence in the kind of impact that these sort of interventions can have. And yeah, with that, one thing I actually started looking at initially was um, malnutrition in general. Like, can we address malnutrition as a startup, as any sort of intervention? Because the numbers are staggering in India. The number of people that are actually malnourished across the country. It's ridiculously high for a country that's working its way towards being recognized as a superpower.
Hmm.
Um, so it started off there, but then there were a couple of pretty interesting sort of incidents that happened where when we were trying to address malnutrition, it became clear that's not there's it's not something that can be solved with one or a bunch of products, because what we want to do is have a product that we can scale across the relevant population and try and achieve a positive outcome. But what we realized was that the malnutrition problem in India is incredibly complex. But on the flip side, and this is the anecdote that I mentioned the last time we spoke, that this while speaking to this lady that runs an NGO in rural Maharashtra, and we spoke to her, that we want to standardize a product that can address the micronutrient malnutrition issue that we're facing in the country. She just asked me, which issue are you going to try and fix? Because if it's for people in the area where her NGO works,
Mhm.
the only thing that grows there is ragi.
Mhm.
And so they have absolutely fine levels of calcium and vitamin D from the way they live their life. But basic things like vitamin C, which anyone living in a city would get with, a glass of juice on the sidewalk, those sorts of things were missing over there because there's no fresh produce, which kind of eventually crystallized into the thought for Nutrova, which is the one population that we can standardize for are urban uh, people living in urban centers,
Yeah.
people that and then we drill down further, 25 to 45-year-olds that are proactive about their wellness. So starting off with that specific demographic, because um, I mean, just I'd love for there to be a complex strategy for that, but the reality is that's the demographic I understood best because I fell into it.
Hmm.
Um, and But yeah, so that's where we started out, and the goal is to develop evidence-based products that actually give you measurable outcomes for this relevant population, and then scale it across wherever we can add value.
Yeah. When you mentioned evidence-based, right, one of the first things that came to my mind was the fact that, and you're right, we buy protein powder. I think that's the a few things, vitamin C supplements, protein powders. These are things where we're not necessarily going by ingredients, or you're just going by someone said you should just buy this. You'll have, let's say, a gym trainer who says no, buy this protein, or you will see someone post something online and say, okay, this seems interesting. And that's how we've always bought a lot of these things which are supposed to give us nutrition. So how do you kind of build in evidence is something that you talk to your consumer to, and kind of explain to them that, because I don't know if even I as a consumer have ever looked at it from that lens, like, okay, I should really look at this from an evidence standpoint and not just generally from, oh, this looks interesting or this has been suggested. How do you kind of cross that bridge?
So that, I think, is one of the tougher hurdles to deal with on a day-to-day basis. But what we see is, particularly in the space of nutrition, is that there's a couple of these factors at play that one would think would make people search for evidence, but for whatever reason they don't. I think there's a large amount of psychology involved in this as well. One thing is that supplements in general are looked at as sort of insurance. What's the worst that could happen? At worst, nothing will happen. It's not like something bad's going to happen over there.
Yeah.
So that's one thought process. And the other is that unfortunately, supplements kind of, not unfortunately, I'm very fortunate because of the regulatory angle, but it's basically a food product. And when it's a food product, like all other food choices, there is a certain cultural or social element to it, which then tends to get a little cliquish and binary when it doesn't need to be binary. And that's sort of, it makes it more of a my favorite restaurant kind of decision, as opposed to my favorite the most effective medicine kind of decision. And this category sort of is on that that border of food and pharma. And so while there are a lot of categories where evidence may not be really essential, like you said, take like vitamin waters and things like that, that have flooded the market. It's not that they're not going to have a dose that's high enough to influence any major outcome. But it's a feel-good factor. It's brilliant communication. It's all those things. But for us, what we're trying to do is, at the end of the day, this is all rooted in science. Whichever way a product gets to market, the basis behind the product, whether it's actually acted on or not, is in science, and science is binary. So a lot of these things we can actually prove or disprove a particular claim. So what we're trying to do is, wherever there is a need for us to actually do studies and measure the clinical effect of a formulation that we have, we're going ahead and following the Clinical Trial Registry of India's rules for actually going ahead with a study. And we've done a couple of those already. And the goal is, wherever required, we add to the body of knowledge that already exists, but with, of course, with our products. So there is a commercial incentive in it for us as well. And so, a category like proteins, for example, you don't need to reinvent the wheel and show that protein is required for XYZ functions in the human body. But within the category of protein supplements, and most people are, in this 25 to 45-year-old age group, at some point have tried some form of protein, whether it was a snack bar or some protein-rich ice cream or whatever it is, or a protein powder, traditional protein powder. What we're trying to do, for example, with our protein, we have this whey protein product that's in the market. And what we've done with that is, we've tried to develop a product with the lowest levels of lactose possible. So we have less than 1% of lactose in our product. It's not detectable. And while to a consumer that doesn't mean anything, what we try and do is show and explain to the consumer what that means. Now, what that means is, there's no lactose, so it's going to be incredibly easy to digest. There's not going to be any bloating, and you're just going to be that much more comfortable after using the product. Little known fact is that close to 70% of Indians have some degree of lactose intolerance. Varying
Oh,
degrees.
wow.
It's a little lower in the north, a little higher in the south. And once you go down each of these rabbit holes, it becomes this really interesting subject because if you look at most of the dairy in our country that's consumed, it's fermented. So
Hmm.
lactose isn't really a problem. But yeah.
I didn't know that. So if it's fermented, then it's not necessarily a problem for someone who's lactose intolerant. Is that the fact?
Yeah, because for the bacteria to grow and ferment something, they use the
Yeah.
lactose as a fuel source. So they break that down into
Yeah.
um, whatever they metabolize it into, which is normally lactic acid and sugar. Which then the sugar they use and the lactic acid makes the stuff acidic, which makes it good, for example.
Have you have you always enjoyed this side of science? Has this always been a point of
Oh yeah,
interest?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's why I got to check myself going down these rabbit holes when I'm having conversations. That it tends to,
No, no. A
yeah.
podcast is the best time to go down one of these rabbit holes because what I find interesting is that when you speak about this, it also I don't think it's just knowledge you've gotten into your mind from a business perspective, right? This is something you genuinely are interested in. What I'd love to explore is that when did this interest level kind of started? I mean, have you always been interested in, let's say, not nutrition, but I would say maybe broader science and everything else, and how much is that kind of fed into how you've built out the products and the company?
So yeah, there's always been an interest in science, and I don't know if this was like an active interest, like an innate interest, or it's just because wasn't that great at history and geography and everything else. So this stuff and just seeing the connection between, you learn something and you can actually see it at work either inside you or around you. That's always fascinated me. And yeah, just being lucky with good teachers along the way, I guess, that keep you interested in something because that I think is a huge factor in keeping you engaged or not. Um, but with regard to how that's influenced the whole product piece, I think over the years, one coming at it from an active interest in the space. So, it's not just about looking at what a report says and then trying to, try and make a product to fit that gap in the market. There's, there is value we can add, and the research is there. It's not like this is something that needs to be discovered or it's something complex. The work's been done. There's
Yeah.
fascinating research happening all over the world. There's incredible research happening in India as well. And just bridging that to sort of the market needs. That's something that's always been a lot of fun. Um, like, and then finally, with regard to the actual business, that this tends to be a bit of a hindrance sometimes because this is when you're talking to finance people and
You're
you're
going down
talking to
rabbit
the other,
holes.
yeah, and then they're like, no, just focus on the numbers. Forget about
Yeah.
keep that for a separate discussion. But yeah,
What I also find interesting with just the methodology, right? It's almost an in between where pharma is and where what traditionally nutrition is, because one of the things I remember when we had spoken earlier, before we started recording this, is the fact that when you spoke of bloat, that's something which you had as a personal experience. That's how one of the initial parts of building out the protein powder product kind of came about as well, right? So um, how do you kind of I think I'm asking you two questions at the same time. One is that how do you kind of make sure you have that balance between nutrition and pharma, and I'd also love to kind of get into that story of how that protein powder came to be.
sure. So with regard to the that sort of the finding that balance between pharma and food, there's actually this larger convergence happening across industries where you have the pharma companies realizing that their drug pipelines are drying up. And again, everything with regard to the industries with the disclaimer of not the last 12 months, but otherwise, pharma had there were limitations in the new molecules coming out, the new sort of opportunities to come out with drugs to solve problems. And on the other end of the spectrum, food companies are realizing that consumers are getting more and more conscious about how healthy they are. So there is this convergence where pharma is trying to get a little more consumer friendly, and have products that are a little more accessible, whether it's through something like supplements or, um, I mean, you look at any pharma company in the country today and anywhere in the world, they tend to have an OTC division,
Hmm.
which is something that can be sold without a prescription.
Yeah.
So that's at one end of the spectrum. The other end is you have all your your Pepsis and Cokes coming out with vitamin waters or energy bars or
Hmm.
fruit juices, or like, so that convergence is happening, and each one's realizing that um, the battlefield finally is going to be in this whole wellness space, and so they're bringing their expertise and moving in that direction. So I think that for us, that's a really interesting area, because right now it's pretty nascent. No one really knows what works and what doesn't. How much
Hmm.
is too much science for a consumer, and how much is too little for a health conscious individual.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty interesting bit. With regard to the second question on the protein powder, so what we did was, when we were looking at this space, that we know this convergence is happening, but and it's not like we were the first ones to the party. So we wanted to find categories that was still very low. They had a very low number of players in them. And one that, when we got started, had absolutely no domestic players was supplements for skin
Hmm.
and hair, to be precise. So we developed this collagen hydrolysate-based product and did a clinical study on that, which we published in an international journal, which showed dramatic improvements to skin health in an Indian population, which is again something that hadn't been done before.
Hmm.
Statistically significant, ethics committee approved, the whole shebang for a clinical study. Um, and while all this work was going on, uh, for whatever reason, I just decided I wanted to start using protein powders again. So just bought something off the market, and it just completely messed me up.
Hmm.
And then there's this whole other issue, which is a whole other tangent of adulteration and
Hmm. Yeah, you
fraudulent
don't know what you're
products and
buying if it's right or
exactly,
not. Yeah.
yeah. Um, Expired goods being relabeled. There's a lot of this stuff that exists in the world. It's not just an Indian problem, but
Hmm.
so I just figured it would be easier if we just went to our R&D and said, look, we work with a bunch of raw material suppliers. So we spoke to some of the people we work with, got the lowest lactose grade that we could find. And I
Hmm.
just had an R&D sample sent to the factory and said that, look, just make this for me. And I told them what to formulate it with. And so they sent it, and I was happily using that. Got a couple of people to try it out, and they were just blown away. There was no artificial sweeteners, and just a little cocoa powder and some flavor to make it a little more palatable. But people loved it.
Hmm.
And, and they said, why aren't you selling this? It was one of these really sort of, yeah, no, I was just saying that with regard to this product, we knew it was never going to be a mass market product.
Hmm.
And the protein market is incredibly crowded. And it's also incredibly price sensitive.
Also, it's tough for
So
consumers to
it's
choose. I
something,
think for a consumer, it's just crazy if you want to buy one. And when you mentioned bloat, for me that was interesting because I feel that's the number one thing everybody talks about: bloat and digestion. But that's never been something which is I've seen out there in terms of communication.
yeah. And the crazy thing is that, even though most people we've spoken to on an individual level sort of relate to that issue with protein supplements, I mean, it's one of those topics, like digestive health is not something that
Hmm.
is openly discussed as much as
Yeah.
one would think, especially given the implications it has. Like, that's a whole other area that we're looking at down the line. Because the kind of research coming out on digestive health and how it impacts mental health, how it impacts pretty much everything. It's just fascinating, and that's another area of focus that we want to get into like over the next few years.
Um, when you started off, one of the core things which obviously would be something you had to figure out was a how do you manufacture, manufacturing and distributing, but more manufacturing ingredients. I'm guessing that would have been something to kind of cross, right? Because um, you would have to figure out a lot of stuff. So I'd love to hear about how that initial phase was and how you kind of crossed some of those stages.
Yeah. So that bit was that was you know it on one part, it was a lot of fun because this is again stuff that I enjoyed getting into, and so that made it a whole lot easier. But also, my experience prior to starting this was running a manufacturing setup that made ingredients for B2B and also made finished products where we imported a lot of these high-end
Okay.
ingredients to make. That was more diagnostics, but the principle stayed pretty much the same. Where and again, because these things are, if you know what you want in the product, these things are objectively measurable. It's not, it's not a color or a shade of something where there's variance. If we
Yeah.
want a grade that has a certain level of something, we know what to ask for. Whether we get it or not is a whole other thing. So the first step was figuring out the ingredients we want to work with, reaching out to suppliers. We tested a lot of raw material suppliers while developing our products, and that took a lot of time. Luckily, the company I used to work with, they were just incredible about it. And every time I had a request to let them, for them to let me use their lab for some time, they were completely cool with that. So, like on weekends, use their lab a couple of times and test stuff out, whatever couldn't get tested,
Yeah.
conventionally through commercial labs. And but that was pretty interesting. The With regard to manufacturing, there was a bit of a hurdle because um, the because of capacity. Going in, a lot of manufacturers only want to work with certain minimum volumes, and this is another thing. Again, using this protein supplement story as a sort of an example, people don't want to divert from what they've always done. So if they've always made protein powders which have a higher amount of lactose and artificial sweeteners in it, there's a lot of resistance to changing that around, irrespective of what the market research says, irrespective of what consumers say. Because the manufacturers are manufacturers. For them, scale is more important than, I mean, on average, again, I don't want to generalize here, but on average, that was a little bit of pushback that we faced. Um, Funnily enough, the manufacturer our primary manufacturer that we work with right now, it got to this point of real frustration. And again, given the background in handling a manufacturing setup, I was just looking at YouTube videos and the kind of equipment you would need for, putting together that sort of a setup. And I came across a video on YouTube of the manufacturer we work with right now talking about his facility. And it happened to be a little outside Bombay. So just randomly cold called, went and met him. And uh, a colleague at the company that I used to work with, who used to head production, stayed very close to the facility. So I just told him to come along with me. And he again just obliged, thankfully. And yeah, it's just one of those serendipitous things, yeah, where our manufacturer's brother and this colleague of mine had worked together at some point, and so he was just a little more open
Yeah.
to to sort of listening, hearing us out, and and he actually said this to me. He said, "You're not going to be able to sell a protein powder without sweetener in it," and but he made it anyway, which is the important bit.
Yeah.
So that was a great find on YouTube of all places.
Yeah, and that's actually a point I want to pick on, right? Is that if you look at how the consumer of today kind of gets information, you are constantly googling stuff. You're finding some stuff online. You're finding something on YouTube. You see something pop up on Instagram. Um, as a brand for you, on one end, I feel that education obviously is a large part of what you have to do in terms of communication. Where you're talking about, it's not just about you need this. Like, this is why you need this this is why you need this to make that choice, because I think a lot of consumers don't know, but is completing the cycle easier now that you can actually just say, okay, this is the information, this is how you click to buy, and you get it delivered, versus how it would have traditionally be that you have to find a physical distribution pipeline, stores, and all that stuff. How has the how have you looked at direct to consumer, and how has that kind of helped, or like become a part of how you drive, just the way you connect consumers and make them buy?
I don't think we'd have been able to even grow the little bit that we have without access to consumers through these channels. Um, Again, something that you asked earlier, that how do you, sort of reach that midpoint between food and pharma. Uh, I think social media channels like Instagram, for example, and even YouTube, we haven't fully explored YouTube yet, but social media works incredibly well to take a message and communicate it in a way that is appealing to a consumer.
Hmm.
So, traditional pharma communication, it tends to be a little too technical, not really focused on the aesthetic. Um,
Yeah.
Dumps a lot of information on a consumer.
Hmm.
Even OTC products, there's very few companies that have gotten that right. But
Yeah.
the thing with these channels is that it gives you that sort of low risk opportunity to try different things out and see what sticks. And that's something that's really, I think it's absolutely for this whole direct to consumer story in this category. I think that these channels it would be impossible without them. Because if you look at it, even the traditional way of physical distribution and being in stores, you can't really communicate that much on a shelf strip or a leaflet
Hmm.
lying around somewhere. And the other great thing about these channels is that they're at any given point of time, because of the sheer scale uh, and the lack of constraints on geography, on time of day, all those sorts of things.
Yeah.
At any given point of time, there's going to be someone close to the right state of mind of buying one of the products,
Hmm.
whatever product, whatever company. But there's always someone who it's on the back of their mind that, okay, I want to do something about, um, like take immunity, for example. That's not a category we go in because there's not a lot of data to support a lot of claims. But the I read an article today. It was on the print, I think, either today or yesterday, about the ridiculous number of zinc and vitamin C capsules that have sold in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
Um, Categories that were decreasing in 2019 have grown like 50, 100% in, just purely on the back of immunity.
I plead guilty. I have vitamin C
Yeah,
what is that? Effervescent tablets
yeah,
every day. I drink that. So yes, I'm one
yeah,
of those people who has doubled down on vitamin C in the last year.
yeah. All of us have. But that's actually the other side, and this is a little interesting and might be slightly off topic. But the other side of these channels is that it reduces barriers for everyone, which is amazing. And again, just to reiterate, we would not have been able to achieve any sort of traction without this, because our concepts are new, our communication is new, our
Yeah.
formulations are new, like everything.
Hmm.
So that worked really well. But the flip side of that, which is something that we are generally very wary of, um, and I wish this is something that everyone could be a little wary of, is making sure that we aren't misleading consumers. There's a very fine line between saying that our collagen product is this is what has been proven to do in a study XYZ, and taking it that one step further and says you'll have fair and glowing skin.
Hmm.
Now, I
Yeah.
mean, again, not to say that that's something that we want to do or we were ever going to do, but the market size just shifts dramatically the second you start
Hmm.
throwing in words like
Yeah.
glow and
Yeah.
appearance and
It's a
that.
whole
So
different whole wider
uh,
category of things.
yeah. But again, since we're sticking to the science, our boundaries are pretty clear. These are the facts. This is what we can measure. This is what we know. But what happens is there's a lot of fly-by-night people that get into the market and start making false claims, um, and people aren't stupid. Eventually, consumers realize what is legitimate and what's not. But because this is such a nascent category, because this is such a new industry and a new concept for a lot of consumers, um, I just hope that it doesn't get to a point where there's just a general cynicism that builds in for the category. And
Yeah.
yeah, but I guess we'll only have to wait and see how that plays out.
One of the pieces which I remember you had mentioned to me when we'd spoken last was the fact that a lot of these products, you can turn around and say, okay, this has this much vitamin C in it, but then you add in the fact it's got amla, which is giving you that vitamin C, and 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 that's interesting because in many times when you see that okay, it has so much vitamin C, so I'm going to buy it. Um, how do I as a consumer today look at a product and say one second, what are the things I need to look at from just changing my lens a little bit when I'm buying a product that is nutrition but is also giving me benefits, If you had to pick a few things that I need to really look at, and almost like how it's basically your methodology, but I'm just saying from a consumer lens, what would those be?
I think hands down, read the back of a label. I think that's the single most important thing to do, because um, the sort of things you can say loud and front and center on the front of a pack, you legally can't on the back. The FSSAI, the Food Safety and Standards Authority, they tell you exactly what needs to be listed in a nutritional table, what the RDAs are, so you have to state the percent of the RDA that you're using. The ingredients have to be mentioned in decreasing order of quantity.
Yeah.
So so all of those things, there's a legal obligation to do that. Whereas on the front, you can put some loud font and some stars and stuff around it,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
showcase something. This vitamin C is an interesting one though, because last time I checked, a lot of the supplement products would mention 500 mg or 1000 mg and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And through popular culture, and there's this general belief that half a gram to a gram, that's 500 to 1000 mg of vitamin C is generally going to help with immunity or whatever else you want to. And the objective measurements there is another discussion, but that's a general belief. But as per the FSSAI, you can't exceed 80 milligrams in a food supplement. If you want to have 500 milligrams or 1000 milligrams, you need to it's regulated as a drug. You need a drug license for that. So we haven't really gone too much into that because that's not an area of interest for us. And it's not an area of interest because we can't add the kind of doses that would actually make a difference.
Yeah.
But I think when you turn around and look at the label, if let's say something's coming from an amla extract, it'll say amla extract 500 mg, or tomato extract or 500 mg, whatever it is, whatever extract 500 mg, not to pick out on any one ingredient. And again, not to say that that isn't good for you, but it's not 500 milligrams of vitamin C.
Yeah. Which is, it's an interesting point, and I've never looked at the label from that lens. And also, I feel that you also realize consumers are looking at nutrition differently, because the other day, this is one of my favorite recent examples. Buy a bag of peanuts. Peanuts bag, and it's what, one of those roasted peanuts. Definitely not the healthiest thing you can have. It says high on protein right on top. I have never seen, and this is like one of the most popular brands around, right? I'm not going to name it, but I'm like, 1 second. I've been buying these peanuts for years. This is the first time this year when I suddenly see this high on protein, big stamp right on top. And I'm like, every category is trying to be nutrition now, in a bizarre way, and I guess that all those lines are getting crossed.
Yeah, this ties back into that convergence where food companies are realizing that there is an interest in health and wellness, and there's also a limited understanding now. So here's the interesting thing, right? So as the food safety, the FSSAI, their regulation states what constitutes something that's high in protein. So high in protein is a label claim, and it needs to meet certain standards to do that. But when the regulator is a food regulator and they have to regulate food, so whether it's the bag of peanuts or our protein supplement, the claims are, so technically peanuts are a relatively high protein food in the context of, rice being a relatively low protein food than peanuts. That it gets down to the brass tacks of that, and
it's
that's
basically how do you connect them together then?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at it today, a couple of months ago, there was this report on the state of health in the country. I forget what it was called. I think it was the NHFS survey, and protein deficiency is actually increasing in India, even though incomes are. I mean, again, the disclaimer of the last 12 months, incomes are going up, and a lot of consumption of food in India is grain driven. So it's
Yeah.
grain forward. A lot of the protein and is coming by way of grains, not by way of added protein by or uh, or one of those things. And I think the what's what's interesting is that when you come to the definition of high protein, for the regulator, peanuts are high protein because they do contain a, the right kind of protein that will be absorbed in a particular way that will add value to someone who's not supplementing or not eating meat or
Yeah.
that sort of thing. But with regard to the context of someone who's into fitness and wants added protein to add value to their whatever their fitness goal is, peanuts aren't necessarily going to cut it. And there's a
Mm.
flip side to that as well. Peanuts are incredibly calorie dense.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
wherever you as soon as you flip the label, you'll see that. So gram for gram. And again, not trying to make a product pitch over here, but if you're having a scoop of whey protein, which
Mm.
has 25 grams of protein in it, you will it would be about 110 calories for
Mm.
ballpark, because there's not much else apart from that whey protein in the product.
Yeah.
To get 25 grams of protein from peanuts, you'd be in the ballpark range of about 800 calories,
Mm.
which is about a third of um, an average Indian male's calorific recommendation for the day.
Mm.
Um, so it's is that a should that be a primary protein source? Sure, but there's a cost associated with that,
Of course.
and you just have to eat a lot of it. So
Spend your day
it's
eating peanuts then.
yeah, yeah. Um,
Up.
so that the label should the labels would put that into perspective, and just understanding what those things mean. It's pretty straightforward, but I think the percentages, like this much percent of your recommended daily allowance. I
Mm.
think that's taking a look at that should make things a lot easier for consumers.
Um, what are the areas of focus for you in terms of just product ranges and kind of how you looking to scale up the company and its offering?
So for us, we have seen a lot of traction in the skin health space. One, because of course it's a category that more and more people are interested in, the whole aesthetic outcome. But the underlying causes that go into skin health, they just tend to be increasing in our day-to-day lives. Um, First of all, being a tropical country for the most part, there is that much more sunlight. There's pollution's just you know out of hand in whichever city you're in this country.
Mm.
Um, Diets aren't exactly trending in the right direction. We're moving away from stuff that works for us towards stuff that doesn't necessarily lead to the best outcome. And so for us, working on skin health becomes the outer manifestation of the inner state of your health. Your skin and hair are the fastest growing cells in your body that you can see. So any sort of adverse outcome with what's going on inside is going to be reflected there. And that's an interesting space for us because you can affect real change. And we've seen that through our collagen product and the study we've done. So working on conditions that that consumers sort of deal with on a day-to-day basis, but are relying on topical applications, which the purpose of your skin is to not let stuff into your body.
Mm.
Uh, so nutrition seems to be a more reliable way to address the underlying causes of the issues that a lot of people deal with. So that's one thing that we're looking at. Um, we're also looking at digestive health in a big way. That's a couple of years away, but the kind of research coming out on digestive health is just phenomenal. And the correlation with digestive health, neurological health, mental health, um, it's just fascinating. And it's really interesting also because you have a lot of these vitamin deficiencies like D3, B12 that are pretty rampant in the Indian population. But you also see them in people that are nutritionally adequate. The consumption's adequate.
Mm.
And it seems to be tied into the way their gut biome is sort of wired.
Mm.
Um, and that, I mean, in my personal opinion, at least, that's the next big frontier in medicine, in health, in wellness, and everything. It's again a poorly understood space across the board, not just by players and like players like us, but there's no one right answer. So now this is one of the experiments that while toying around with products that I kind of regret doing, where looked at a lot of like a very very surface level that probiotics are good, so more probiotics are better. That's not how it works. Uh, you will really upset your stomach with a high dose of probiotics that you don't need. Um, yeah, so digestive health for sure, and seeing how that ties into to neurological health and mental wellness. That's going to be a big area for us moving forward as well.
Um, uh, how has the journey of being an entrepreneur been? I mean, what have you kind of learned since you started off? Because obviously, um, there's deep love for the science of it, deep love for the product, which is very evident. But being an entrepreneur, like you said, comes with things like finance and comes with a lot of other things that comes with managing a team and all that stuff. How has that been for you through this entire piece?
So that is a constant learning process. So this is something that my old boss had told me. I mean, the one who had started the company that I used to work at. He said initially you'll have a product problem, then you'll have a sales problem, then you'll have an HR problem, and then you'll have a product problem again. And it's just
Yeah,
this endless loop as you scale a company.
so true.
And yeah, I mean, just seeing that firsthand, you spend a lot of time on the product, but then, like the question you asked, how do you communicate those benefits to your audience and to your consumer base and get them to buy it? And once you made some traction in that direction, you need to start building the team a little, get a larger team to actually scale things. And then that becomes another sort of, roadblock to get over. But I think couple of interesting learnings along the way have been, uh, particularly coming at it from a product perspective. I think the big learning would have been that has been just because you think a product is cool doesn't mean everyone else is going to. So just make sure you have enough cash front ended to,
Yeah,
uh, see that through to it's like give it the attention it deserves with resources. Because that communication, and I think there's the flip side of having all these channels to access consumers is that for a consumer, in my opinion, there's a lot of noise coming their way as well. And it's like you said, it's really hard for a consumer to know what is actually good for them. And there's an overwhelming amount of choice that
yeah,
for you to cut through the clutter and actually showcase what you have to the right consumers, it takes time and it takes money at the end of the day. And a mistake that I made and we made as a company is being a little too idealistic about how quickly the product would be accepted. So, you know, uh, and again, this it's easy to analyze in hindsight, but we a lot of the money that we could have put into marketing, we put into clinical studies. So, while in the short term, there was an upper limit on how much we could market. What we saw was because we were going in with this much data and we were sure of the product, so we could confidently tell people about the product. We see a really high repurchase rate. Um, and I think that balance is something that every entrepreneur is going to have to figure out for themselves.
yeah.
I and again, like you said, there's a very clear bias towards product for me personally. So so that tends to be where the resources are allocated. But learning that it can't just be about product, it's also about getting the product to consumers, making sure that they understand what the offering is, and having the resources to put an amazing team together. I think those are critical, and that took some learning. It wasn't, in the actual execution of that is something that's been a pretty steep learning curve.
Yeah.
Yeah, and with regard to people, managing people, I think I think I don't think anyone's got that right. I think,
There is no right answer to that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Uh, you know, towards the end of every episode, I do this segment where I ask my guests questions more about them rather than about their company, about what they're building and stuff. And one of the first things I tend to ask everyone is that, what is you're obviously passionate about what you do, about your product, about the science behind it. Is there something parallelly different from that which you enjoy consuming a lot of, which people would be like, really, I thought you were obsessed about all of this stuff. You do this too, or like you spend so much time doing whatever this X could be. What is your what is that for you?
Activity-wise, I'm really into combat sports, like mixed martial arts and stuff like that.
That's interesting. And as in watching
So
everything, all
so
ends of it.
prior watching for sure, but till the lockdown, I was really into Krav Maga, which is this self-defense,
Hmm.
Israeli self-defense.
Hmm.
The last 6 years prior to the lockdown. Now, of course, training's become a little constrained, but
Sorry, I've lost your. It broke a few times. The video got stuck
saying
a couple of times.
Krav Maga, that's yeah. So I was into that. Really got into the training. Became an instructor with the IKMF. That's a whole other. That's sort of the so mixed martial arts watching for sure. But from 2014, I've been training pretty regularly in Krav Maga, which is this Israeli self-defense form. And yeah, really got into that. Did an instructor course with the IKMF, which is based in Israel. And yeah, so that kind of stuff. So started boxing classes just before the lockdown. Really, really into that kind of stuff.
I'm really intrigued by the stuff that fascinates you. Because of all the stuff that you've spoken about, both the product side, and when I flip it around, you're talking Israeli martial arts. I'm truly intrigued to learn about all the stuff that really gets you interested.
Yeah.
Whi- Which brings me to my, which is one question which I always found to be most interesting because it's simple, but I find the answers are great. Is that what can you put together in an instant?
Oh wow. Uh, Definitely not an answer to a question like this, um, but yeah, food. I'm a pretty decent cook.
Yeah. What
Um,
can you put together? What's your
it's just
push comes to shove? What can you put together right
a
away?
default setting, like any breakfast thing, like anything with eggs in it. Default
Yeah.
setting. That's like in an instant. In an instant, practiced at various levels of inebriation successfully.
Anything that you've read, listened to, or watched in recent times that you'd recommend that someone should kind of catch up on?
There's this fascinating book I just finished. It's called Why We Sleep by Matthew
Hmm.
Walker.
Hmm.
I think that's it's one of the most eye-opening things that I've read. And for people in this whole entrepreneurship journey, there's this sort of pride in
Not
working
sleeping.
a lot more than not sleeping and pushing yourself. But I mean, after reading that book, it kind of turns all of that on its head. And yeah, there's some pretty cool podcasts out there. There's this really cool one by this thing called the Huberman Lab, Andrew Huberman. You
Yeah.
should check that out. It's really, really cool.
He's also started a bunch of YouTube videos. I've been watching them lately. I think he's just started doing some of those as well.
Yeah, from his lab. But he's been doing there's those like 15, 20 really big podcasts out there. So he's been doing the rounds over there and
Yeah.
talking about his stuff. But essentially taking neurobiology and bringing it to like lay audiences like us.
Uh, and what my last question too is, why do you think, although when I put it in your case, it'd be interesting. Why do you think our focus on nutrition will never die? Because I'm like, the answer is because we will die. But I mean, like, what would your response on that be?
I think that what we consume is a large part of who we are. There's a huge cultural element to it. And with more access to a more varied set of individuals, a lot of us are finding people that we relate to that aren't necessarily in our house or in our neighborhood or in our office. And a lot of that sort of cultural basis stems from what we eat and what we, what our choices are, what our preferences are. And I think that's
Right.
something that's always going to keep our interest in nutrition. And again, the other aspect of that answer is, for better or worse, people are associating nutrition with how they look.
Hmm.
And I
Yeah.
think that's one thing that's never going to die. Uh,
That's so true. Thanks a ton, Akshay. I think it's been a fascinating episode because I feel like you have made science seem interesting to me, and I was a person who studied science, did engineering, and didn't necessarily like many parts of it. But and I'm sure everyone listening in gotten enough of that as well from a childhood. Thanks for coming on Advertising Instead.
I really appreciate it, man. Thanks a lot.